Hello everyone, this is Jeff at Mississippi in the Civil War. For the latest episode, I'm actually going to do a series, and I know from the comments I've gotten from some of my previous videos that a lot of you that are watching had relatives that served in Mississippi units during the Civil War. So I thought it might be good to do a basic video on how you research your Mississippi Civil War ancestor. And this information will apply to men who served in the Confederate Army and those that served in the Union Army. And this is going to be a four-part series and this is the layout I plan to do. On tonight's episode, I'll give just a brief overview of the kinds of units that Civil War soldiers served in, and an overview of the Civil War service records and the information they contain. In episode 2, I will talk about Civil War pensions and burial information and making the most of those records. In episode 3, I will cover Civil War veterans organizations such as the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the Grand Army of the Republic, and the wealth of information you can find from those organizations. And then the final episode will cover researching your ancestor's Civil War unit, how to find out more about what exactly they experienced during the war by following their regiment through the course of the war. And tonight I'm going to start with just a basic overview of what it was like to be a Mississippian serving either in the Union Army or Confederate Army. And during the Civil War, thousands of Mississippians served in the armies, and whether they wore Confederate gray or Union blue, these men really distinguished themselves on battlefields in more than a dozen states. And I just included this map here. This is a wartime map of Mississippi made in 1864. Looks not too different than a map of Mississippi today. The only real big difference is that there are less counties, because we have a number of counties that were created after the Civil War, and of course those wouldn't be represented on a map made in 1864. And I'm going to start by giving you just a little overview of the Confederate Army. And the war lasted as long as it did in large part because Southerners were willing to lay down their lives by the thousands, fighting for their homes and really laying it all on the line for a cause they believed in. There were approximately between 78,000 and 82,000 Mississippians who served in the Confederate armies during the war. It's hard to put an exact number on it because the records are, in a lot of cases, are just so fragmentary or even non-existent, but that's going to be somewhere around the number 78,000 to 82,000. And shown here is one of my favorite pictures of Mississippians taken during the war. This is a very early war photograph and depicts the 9th Mississippi Infantry at Pensacola, Florida, taken in 1861. It's just a great image of early war troops. And the Union regiments raised in Mississippi in large part got their start in the spring of 1863. And it was in March of 1863 that the U.S. Secretary of War issued an order directing Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas to organize black regiments in the Mississippi Valley. On May 22, 1863, the War Department established the Bureau of Colored Troops to handle the recruitment, organization, and service of black regiments. And black Mississippians, almost all of them former slaves, reacted to this call by enlisting in the thousands. All told, Mississippi is credited with having 17,869 African Americans serve in the Union armies during the Civil War. But I can tell you, this number is almost certainly low because many Mississippians joined up with units that are credited to other states. They joined up with regiments from Alabama and Tennessee and Louisiana. So that 17,000 number is almost certainly low, probably by several thousand at least. Now, there was also one white regiment raised from the state of Mississippi, the 1st Mississippi Mounted Rifles. They numbered about 500 men. And again, this 500 number is certainly too low because there were a number of Mississippians, particularly those living in areas where slavery was not very profitable, in the northeast hill section of the state, also down in the piney woods in the southern part of the state. There were lots of Unionists in those parts of the country, and a lot of them joined up with the first Union regiment they came across. So it was not unusual for men from this state to be serving in a unit from, say, Illinois or from Tennessee. In fact, there was a number of Mississippians from Tishomingo County all went up together, joined the 6th Tennessee Cavalry U.S. They were Unionists. They did not want to be forcibly conscripted into the Confederate Army, so they thought they'd better go while the getting was good. They got out, went up to Tennessee, and the first Union regiment they came across, they joined up. And that was not uncommon at all. And this image I used is one of my favorites. The illustration is entitled The War in Mississippi. The 1st Mississippi Negro Cavalry bringing into Vicksburg rebel prisoners of war captured at Haynes Bluff. And this was from Frank Leslie's Illustrated News, dated December 19th, 1863. And the 1st Mississippi Regiment, later to be redesignated the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry, was one of the most hard-fighting regiments that the state produced. They saw a lot of action, particularly in 1864 and early 1865. They made raids all through Mississippi, and they developed quite a reputation for hard fighting. So it was really a very, very well commanded and well disciplined unit. Now, your relatives that would have fought in the Civil War took part in one of the most important historical events in United States history. And it was going to have just an amazing impact on the future of the state. And this lecture is just designed to give you the basic tools you need to find out about your relative's part in that great drama of the Civil War. And this illustration, again, is another favorite of mine. This shows Union troops raising the United States flag over the Capitol building in Jackson in May of 1863, and it was published in Harper's Weekly June 20th, 1863. And you would know that building better today as the Old Capitol Museum. I've been going there since I was a kid. I love that building. Now, the first step when you want to try and determine who your relatives were that fought in the Civil War, you need to start looking at your family tree and determining who would have been of the correct age to have served. And just to illustrate the wide differences in ages you would find in Civil War soldiers, this African American soldier on the left looks like he's barely into his teens, whereas on the right, this is William L. Brandon, who was colonel of the 21st Mississippi Infantry. He was about 60 years old when he enlisted in 1861. Got badly wounded at the Battle of Malvern Hill in July of 1862, had a leg amputated, and survived the amputation and lived another 20 years, although his active military duty was over. So you're going to want to be looking for men in your family tree that could be anywhere from early teens on up into their 40s and 50s, because men like that would have, if nothing else, probably served in the state troops in some capacity, freeing up younger men to serve in the regular Confederate Army. Now, one of the key tools to finding your Civil War relatives is the use of a good index. And the National Archives has both Union and Confederate indexes to men who served in the Civil War from Mississippi. And this is how we did it in old school, microfilm. And you can see it's all scarred up, it's hard to read, but it would be comprised of cards like this that just had the soldier's name, his rank, and the unit he served in. And then that would give you the basic information you needed to go to the microfilm roll for that unit and pull his actual service record. Now, Union soldiers, the same. They also had, there's a very good published roster of Union soldiers, and this covers Union soldiers that served from every state of the Union, including Mississippi. This one is put out by Broadfoot. It's an excellent resource. But again, if your library doesn't have a copy, fortunately there are online alternatives. Now, one other published index, and this one is specifically related to Mississippians, Grady Howell's 3-volume For Dixieland, I'll Take My Stand, is probably the best published index to all the Mississippians who served in the Confederate armies and Navy. Most major libraries are going to have this set, and I highly recommend it. It's very well researched, very well done, and it's an excellent resource. Now, some of the online sites that you can use, one of the free ones is the Soldiers and Sailors database put out by the National Park Service. And you can search for your soldier or sailor, depending on what branch of service he was in, and it will give you the basic information, just unit, company, and rank. But that will give you the basic information you need to get a service record for the soldier. And I will give you a link to this site at the end of the video. And then another site. Now this one is not free. This one does cost a little bit of money, but it's well worth it. For about less than $10 a month, you can get a subscription to fold3.com, and it has not only the indexes, but also the actual service records for all Mississippians who served in the Confederate armies, and it also has a lot of the service records for men who served in the United States Colored Troops, also from Mississippi, and for all the other states as well. It doesn't cost very much, and also if you look, there are several times a year they'll usually have several days where they open up the records for free, usually around Veterans Day or Memorial Day. If you look, they're every year without fail they have several days throughout the year where they'll open up their records and let you use them for free. And I'll put a link to this website in the endnotes as well. Now, before we go into your relative service record, I want to give you just a little basic information about how Civil War armies were organized. And the largest branch of service was, of course, the Army in both the Union and Confederacy. And the building block of any Civil War army, be it Union or Confederate, was the regiment. And Union or Confederate, a regiment numbered about 1,000 men and officers when it was first raised. Now, the twin killers of disease and combat would narrow these numbers down very quickly. By the mid-war, a typical regiment was going to be lucky to have somewhere between 300 and 400 men. There was just so much loss, particularly from disease, and so. To full strength mid-war, you're probably going to see a regiment like this. It's going to number no more than maybe 300, 350, 400 at the outside. And a regiment, which started off the war at 1,000 men, would also be broken down into companies. And shown in this picture here is one company of African-American soldiers. This was taken at Vicksburg in 1864 or early 1865. And you had a regiment commanded by a colonel, seconded by his lieutenant colonel, and the third in command was the major. You had 10 companies in each regiment. Each company was commanded by a captain with second in command a first lieutenant. And a company in a regiment, when the regiment was formed, each company was given a specific letter designation. And it would be A through K, omitting the letter J. In the 19th century script, I and J looked almost identical, and the Army, to avoid any mistake in written orders, they just omitted the letter J. So you would have a company A through I, skip J, and then you would have a company K. And when it came to Confederate regiments, the organization was basically the same. 1,000-man regiment, companies, 10 of them, 100 men each. Again, by the mid-war period, they're going to be down to less than half that number. In fact, considerably less than half that number. Very often, Mississippi regiments, their individual companies would have a company nickname, something like the Jeff Davis Rifles, or which is Company D of the 9th Mississippi Infantry, which is shown in this picture here, or the Crystal Springs Southern Rights, or the Octibaha Plowboys. They tried to give themselves, fancy, patriotic, fierce-sounding names. And later, once they were formally organized as a regiment, they would, of course, be given letter designations for the companies, A through K, omitting the letter J, of course. Union regiments, again, the organization was pretty much the same. Most of the organization of federal regiments in the state, what were known as USCT regiments, United States Colored Troops, the organization of these regiments took place near two places, Vicksburg or Natchez, both on the Mississippi River. And they were almost entirely composed, to the regiments that were formed in these two cities, of former slaves who had escaped bondage and had flocked to these cities wanting to fight for their freedom. And that's why I chose this particular image. This is a illustration of the Battle of Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, which took place June 7th, 1863, right across the river from Vicksburg. And this was where the first black Mississippians from Mississippi actually fought in combat. Members of the 1st Mississippi Infantry of African descent fought in this battle, and even though they were extremely green, they were brand new soldiers, had no experience whatsoever. They acquitted themselves very well, fought very bravely, suffered very heavy casualties, and really impressed both Union and Confederate soldiers that fought beside them with how well they fought in this battle. Now, one of the least understood branches of the service during the Civil War was artillery. And during the Civil War, artillery was the smallest branch of the service. It was an elite and highly skilled branch of service. It needed the best of the best. These guns were highly complex. They needed a lot of delicate care and maintenance. It also took a lot of skill to fire at ranges of up to 2 miles or more and accurately hit what you were shooting at. So the artillery units tended to contain some of the brightest and best soldiers on each side. And Civil War artillery was classified into two main types of artillery. You had first light artillery, which is shown in this picture. Those were guns small enough to travel with the armies. And then you also had heavy artillery, which tended to be placed into large fortifications. And this picture was taken at Vicksburg in 1864 or early 65. This is Battery Sherman, one of the Union defenses protecting Vicksburg. It was manned by the 5th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. These guns were so heavy and so hard to move, you just tended to put them in one place and not move them at all if you could help it. Now, Civil War artillery was organized around a battery, and shown in this picture here is a Union battery of 6 guns. Confederates also used batteries of 6 guns, although sometimes they would pare it down to 4 guns just for ease of handling. Also, sometimes they had shortages of guns. But inside of a battery, you had a total of 6 guns. Every 2 guns was a section. The overall battery was commanded by a captain. Each 2-gun section was commanded by a lieutenant. And a typical battery, Union or Confederate, would have approximately 155 men, including officers and non-commissioned officers. Very often, batteries would be named after their commander. Good example, Sweat's Mississippi Battery. And Union regiments that were raised from Mississippi, there were only 2 of them, the 5th and 6th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. They were both serving the big guns, and they were in the 5th United States Colored Heavy Artillery was stationed at Vicksburg in the defenses there. The 6th was in the Natchez defenses. Again, heavy guns. They were placed in fortifications where they didn't have to move. They were just protecting the cities. And heavy artillery was typically consisted of 12 companies. And so you will find, in addition to companies A through K, generally with heavy artillery, you will also have companies L and M as well. And our last branch of service that I'm going to talk about is the cavalry. And again, the standard organization of a Civil War army, the basic building block of a cavalry unit was the regiment, which consisted of either 10 or 12 companies. It varied sometimes, also sometimes called squadrons. And on the Confederate side, you also had cavalry battalions, which were made up of less than the 10 or 12 companies that a normal regiment had. If you only had 7 or 8 companies, you would be designated a battalion. And this wasn't uncommon, as Confederates, particularly as the war went on and they were running low on manpower, they had a lot of trouble filling up cavalry units to their full strength. But in each company of a cavalry regiment, you would have between 60 and 80 privates. A captain would command each company, and then a colonel commanded the regiment. And 2 of the primary jobs of cavalry during the Civil War, they served as scouts. They were the eyes and ears of the army. They went out in front, made sure an army didn't blunder into a trap, or and knew what they were marching into. Also, they did a lot of hit-and-run raids, going behind the lines, trying to disrupt the enemy's communications and supply lines. Cavalry units were constantly on the move, and so they spent a lot of hard, weary hours in the saddle doing their jobs, screening the army, making raids, just providing intelligence. They were very skilled, very dedicated troopers. And much the same with Union artillery. And this picture here is a Union sergeant in the cavalry. He's unidentified, unfortunately. This is from the Library of Congress collections. And in the Confederate photo here, those are members of the 1st Mississippi Cavalry serving in the Confederate Army. Very hard fighters. They were some very good troops. Now that we've kind of explained the various types of units that your ancestor may have served in, and there are others. There are specialist troops. There's Navy, but I stuck with just some of the basic Army units, because that's where the majority of your relatives are probably going to have served. But if you want to find out more about what your relative actually experienced during the war, you're going to need to get a copy of his compiled service record. This is the most useful piece of individual information you can find for a specific soldier. And much of the information on these compiled service records were originally on large muster rolls that look like this. These are huge, big pieces of paper that are good, probably 3 feet long and about 2 feet wide. They folded out, and in the late 19th, early 20th century, all the information from these muster rolls was copied onto cards and turned into what were known as compiled service records. They were much easier to access, and they made it much easier for the federal government and the individual state governments to help decide who needed pensions, because pensions are going to take up a considerable part of the federal budget and a lot of the state budgets, because Confederates, of course, were not eligible for federal pensions, but they were eligible for state pensions in a lot of the states. And Mississippi started offering Confederate pensions starting in the late 1880s. And this is what the first card in a service record looks like. And you notice they look almost identical. The one on the left is Confederate, the one on the right is Federal. And since they were both put out by the federal government, they look almost identical. But the information it gives, up at the top, it's going to give the name of the soldier, the company and regiment they served in, whether it was Union or Confederate, and the first rank listed is the rank that the soldier held when they went into service, and the second is the rank they held when they left the service. And you see that, again, with Federal is almost the same: name, company, regiment, rank in, rank out. And with Confederate service records, generally the cards following this first one are going to contain things like a listing of the soldier's name, rank, and unit, card abstracts, relating to the soldier on muster rolls, returns, rosters, payrolls, appointment books, hospital registers, Union prisoner of war registers, parole list, inspection reports. There's any number of items you might find in a soldier service record you're really not going to know until you actually pull it. Union service records are the same. They usually contain a lot of information taken from the muster rolls, regimental returns, hospital rolls, other records. And they're going to tell you basically where a soldier was at a given point in time, what they did, and just give you the basic outline of what the soldier did during the war. Was he ever sick and in the hospital? Was he wounded in a specific battle? If so, how serious was it? Was the soldier ever fined or docked pay or put in the jail for a while? A service record is going to tell you those things, and it's really a great beginning to help you start fleshing out exactly what your relative did during the war. And one thing you should be aware of, the use of initials was very common in the 19th century. L.H. Johnson, that's Littleton Hardy Johnson, but in all of the service records he's just listed as L.H. I know that because this is my great-great-grandfather. And then Jeffrey, and you see it spelled two ways, Jeffrey, and then Jeofrey. That's not uncommon to see names spelled more than one way in a service record. And sometimes you have to look under a lot of variations of names just to figure out exactly how they're listed. And then this shows one of the typical cards in a service record for both Union or Confederate and Union. It's a muster roll, and it's showing what the soldier was doing for a given period of time. Like this one, muster roll covers May and June 1864, and it was taken June 30th of 64, and it shows my great-great-grandfather was absent and he was on leave during that time period. This one for Jeffrey Adams, who was in the 58th United States Colored Infantry. Again, company muster roll. It shows his age, which is something additional. Shows where he was during the period of this muster roll. He was in Natchez, and just shows when he enlisted, August 15th, at Natchez for a period of 3 years. And they're basically, this is what a muster roll does. It accounts for a soldier during a given period of time. And then sometimes the information in a service record can be quite useful. Take, for example, this is a Civil War service record card for another great-great-uncle of mine who served in the 13th Mississippi. Not only does it give the information about when he enlisted and where, it also tells you what state he was born in, what his occupation was, where his residence was, age when he enlisted, if he was married or single, and then also in remarks it says elected second lieutenant or third lieutenant April 26, 1862, resigned August 31st, 1863, and then captured November 29th, 1863. So I know in this case he was elected a lieutenant, served for a short time, found he couldn't hack it as a lieutenant. He just didn't have the wherewithal to be an officer, so he resigned his commission, became a private, and continued serving in the unit until he was captured November 29th, 1863. And so not every service record will be this detailed and give you all this information, but some of them will, and when they do, they can be really useful for trying to find additional details about your relative. And then some service records will also have original documents attached. And this is another example taken from one of my relatives. This is from the service record of my great-great-uncle who died during the Civil War. His name was Daniel Four, and he served in the 38th Mississippi Infantry. And at the time he died, the Confederate government owed him some pay, and his my great-great-great-grandfather, his father, had to file with the Confederate government stating that yes, he was indeed my son. Any monies that were owed to him would come to me because he was unmarried. And so this is the legal document he had to file to get his son's back pay, and it was attached to his service record. So stuff like this can be really helpful. And then something else you can also find in a service record, again, this is my great-great-uncle that served in the 13th Mississippi, and you tend to find this only in Confederate service records for men that served in the Army of Northern Virginia. But it's a listing of every battle that the Army of Northern Virginia was in, and it shows if he was present, captured, wounded, whatever. It gives you the information about his service in each of these battles. So it can be really useful for determining what battles your relative was in. And again, this is just a picture I included of my great-great-grandfather's grave, which is in Louisiana. He moved from Mississippi to Louisiana after the Civil War, lived out the rest of his life there, and then died in 1916. And before we end this, I want to show you the Soldiers and Sailors System and Fold 3. And let me get this up here. There we go. Okay, this is fold3.com, and I'm going to show you how you can look up a Civil War service record. Say your relative served in the 6th Mississippi Infantry. He was in the Confederate Army. You just click on U.S. Civil War, Confederacy, and then click on Publications, and then you just scroll down to, and it's Civil War Service Records, Confederate, Mississippi. Click on it. And then you can either put in the name, or if you know the unit he was in, click on Browse, and then it gives you a listing by unit. And I'm going to scroll down to the 6th Mississippi Infantry. Okay, 6th Infantry. My great-great-grandfather's last name was Johnson, and these are just alphabetical. So let me pull up and then click on the letter J, and then scroll down till I get to the Johnsons. And here we go, Littleton H. Johnson. Click on it, and voila, here's his service record. Starting with the very first card, listing his name, company, regiment, and his rank in and rank out. And then you can just scroll through all of the cards. And they're not always in correct chronological order. Like the very first one in his shows he was a prisoner of war at Vicksburg when the city surrendered July 4th, 1863. Showing he was a parole prisoner at Demopolis, Alabama. So there's a wealth of information you can find from these service records, and you can do the same thing for a Union soldier. Let me go back to home here. You would click on U.S. Civil War Union, and then Publications, and then you have to scroll down, and it's several pages in. But for African American units, here we go, Civil War Service Records, Union, Colored Troops, and then it's broken down by unit. And let's try the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry, because that was a unit raised in Mississippi. Click on, and then Browse, and then 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry. And let's pick a letter at random, E. Okay, Charles Eagley. And then here's his service record. And you can do this for your relative. Just go to the last name, and then again, here's basic information. Charles Eagley, Company I, 3rd Regiment, United States Colored Cavalry, age 19 years old, height 5 feet 6 inches, complexion black, eyes black, hair black, where born, Holmes, Mississippi, probably talking about Holmes County, occupation field hand, he's a former slave that escaped, when he enlisted and where, by whom that he was enlisted, and remarks, died November 28, 1865 at Vicksburg. So you can find all kinds of information about your relative in these service records. And then if you don't know what unit your relative was in, you need an index. The Soldiers and Sailors System from the National Park Service is an excellent one, and an easy way to get there, just go to a Soldiers and Sailors database. Just type that into Google or any search engine, soldiers and sailors, and then here we go. And then click on either soldiers or sailors, depending. You can check both if you don't know whether your relative served in the Army or Navy. But if say he's a soldier, and then you want to do a search, and I'm going to put in Littleton Johnson. Hit go. And you can narrow it down. I know my relative served in Mississippi, so I'm going to click on Mississippi. And here we go, Littleton Johnson, Confederacy, Mississippi, 6th Regiment. So this gives you the basic information about his unit. You can also click on it, and it will give you a brief synopsis of that unit's service. And once you know the regiment, then you can go back to either fold 3, or you can go to, say, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, look up the service record on microfilm, and get a copy of it. It's just that easy. And this, of course, is just a very basic overview. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. If you enjoyed this talk, please give it a like, because it really helps me gauge, how well people are liking what I'm doing, and really enjoy the feedback. But this is just part 1. Part 2 will be coming up very shortly. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I'll be back with more on researching your Confederate ancestor very soon. And thank you very much. Bye.